More than 2 centuries after freedom of speech was enshrined in the First Amendment, that right is very much in the news. Campus speech codes, disinvited commencement speakers, deplatformed professors, jailed performance artists, exiled leakers, a blogger condemned to 1,000 lashes by one of our closest allies, and the massacre of a dozen French cartoonists have forced the democratic world to examine the roots of its commitment to free speech. Is free speech merely a symbolic talisman, like a national flag or motto? Is it just one of many values that we trade off against each other? Was Pope Francis right when he said that, quote, "You cannot make fun of the faith of others"? May universities muzzle some students to protect the sensibilities of others? Did the Charlie Hebdo cartoonists, quote, "cross a line that separates free speech from toxic talk," as the dean of a school of journalism opined at the time? Or is free speech fundamental, a right which, if not absolute, should be abrogated only in carefully circumscribed cases? The answer I will argue this evening is that free speech is indeed fundamental, and it's important to remind ourselves why and to have the reasons at our fingertips when that right is called into question. There's a danger that freedom of speech will become a term of boilerplate, a box to be ticked, an element in a long list of things that people value without being able to explain why. That could even feed a more pernicious development, free speech becoming an identity badge of the political right. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I reviewed the literature on human rationality and discovered that the principal cause of stupidity in the political realm is not, as many scientists suspect, scientific or historical illiteracy, but politicization. As soon as an issue becomes branded as a sacred cause of the political left or the political right, intelligent people shut down their critical faculties. They accept arguments and evidence or blow them off, depending only on which tribe they appear to vindicate. They even lose their ability to do arithmetic. If, through intellectual laziness, we allow free speech to become associated in people's minds with the political right, just because some of the notorious challenges involve left-wing groups suppressing non-left-wing speakers, then it's game over for free speech on college campuses and much of the mainstream media. In talking about free speech, or anything else, we're talking. We're not settling our disagreement by a beauty contest, or an auction, or a pistol duel. Unless you're willing to discredit yourself by declaring, in the words of the great free speech advocate Nat Hentoff, free speech for me but not for thee, then as soon as you show up to a debate to argue against free speech, you've lost it. Second, free speech is the only way to acquire knowledge about the world. Perhaps the greatest discovery in human history, one that is logically prior to every other discovery, is that all of our traditional sources of belief are generators of delusion and should be dismissed as sources of knowledge. These include faith, revelation, dogma, authority, charisma, augury, prophecy, intuition, clairvoyance, conventional wisdom, and the warm glow of subjective certainty. How then can we know? None of us is omniscient, none of us is infallible. Other than by proving mathematical and logical theorems, which are not about the material world, the answer is the process that Karl Popper called conjecture and refutation. We come up with ideas about the nature of reality, and we test them against that reality, allowing the world to falsify the mistaken ones. The conjecture part of this formula, of course, presupposes the exercise of free speech. We offer conjectures without any prior assurance that they're correct. It is only by bruiting ideas and seeing which ones withstand attempts to refute them that we acquire knowledge. The most pressing historical question of the 20th century is how monstrous totalitarian regimes, particularly those of Stalin, Hitler, Mao, and Imperial Japan, came into existence. There are a number of conjectures, such as the popular libertarian hypothesis that societies with extensive social welfare systems and copious government regulation are likely to slide down a slippery slope into totalitarianism. It's an interesting hypothesis with a major flaw, namely that nothing of that sort has ever happened. Instead, fascist and communist regimes come to power through violent intimidation. In every case, groups of armed fanatics used violence to silence or intimidate their critics and adversaries. Even the apparently democratic election of the Nazis in 1933 was preceded by years of intimidation, murder, and violent mayhem against dissenters. And once in power, totalitarians criminalize any criticism of the regime. There's a systematic reason why dictators brook no dissent. One could imagine a regime that is armed to the teeth, can resist any insurrection, and allows its subjects to impotently bitch and moan all they want. But that's not how totalitarian societies work, and for a good reason. The immiserated subjects of a tyrannical regime are not, of course, deluded that they are happy. And if tens of millions of disaffected citizens act together, no regime has the brute force to resist them. The reason that citizens don't resist their overlords en masse is that they lack what logicians call common knowledge in the technical sense, namely the knowledge that everyone else shares their knowledge. Common knowledge is a prerequisite to coordinating behavior for mutual benefit. Two friends will show up at the same cafe at a given time only if each knows that the other knows that both know about the appointment. In the case of civil resistance, people will expose themselves to the risk of reprisal from a despotic regime only if they know that others are exposing themselves to that risk at the same time. In computer simulations of artificial societies, the sociologist Michael Macy has shown that open channels of communication are essential in preventing unpopular beliefs, those that no one believes but that no one dare deny, from becoming entrenched. If true believers can punish skeptics, then a minority view can take over. But if skeptics can sample the beliefs of their compatriots, the collective delusions can unravel. Common knowledge is created by public information, such as a broadcasted statement. The story of the emperor's new clothes illustrates the logic. When the little boy shouted that the emperor was naked, he wasn't telling anyone anything that they didn't already know, anything they couldn't see with their own eyeballs. But he was changing the state of their knowledge nonetheless, because now everyone knew that everyone else knew that everyone else knew that everyone else knew the emperor was naked, and that common knowledge emboldened them to challenge the emperor's authority with their laughter. The story reminds us why humor is no laughing matter, why satire and ridicule, even when puerile and tasteless, are terrifying to autocrats and protected by democracies. Satire can stealthily challenge assumptions that are second nature to an audience by forcing them to see that those assumptions lead to consequences that everyone recognizes are absurd. That's why humor so often serves as an accelerant to social progress. 18th century wise guys like Voltaire, Swift, and Samuel Johnson ridiculed the wars, oppressions, and cruel practices of their day. In the 1960s, comedians and artists portrayed racists as thick-witted Neanderthals, and Vietnam hawks and nuclear cold warriors as amoral psychopaths. The Soviet Union and its satellites also had a rich underground current of satire, as in the common definition of the two Cold War ideologies, quote, capitalism is the exploitation of man by man, communism is the exact opposite. We use barbed speech to undermine not just political dictators, but the petty oppressors of everyday life. The tyrannical boss, the sanctimonious preacher, the blowhard at the bar, the neighborhood enforcer of stifling norms. Now, it may seem outlandish to link American campus freedom, which by historical and global standards is still admirably high, to the world's brutal regimes. But the connection is not totally far-fetched. Last year, I addressed the Oslo Freedom Forum, a kind of TED for political dissidents. I met people who escaped from North Korea by walking across the Gobi Desert in winter, people who were jailed for a single tweet, people whose families were thrown in prison because of their own political activity. These stories put the relatively minor restrictions on campus speech in perspective. But the American commitment to unfettered speech unrivaled even by our democratic allies in Europe, stands as a beacon of inspiration to the world's dissidents, one of the few features of the American brand that still commands global admiration.